looks like we have a good group here. All right. Well, welcome to Philosophy in the Spotlight. We're your hosts, Elisabeth and Chris. And we are so honored to have here today Miguel de la Vega from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. He's a grad student in philosophy working on Edith Stein. How are you, Miguel? Welcome.
Hello, I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes, yeah, hearing you perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Elisabeth and Christopher, for the opportunity, and I hope everyone enjoys this talk and hopefully inspires them to read more about this wonderful philosopher, Edith Stein.
Thank you so much for that, Miguel.
That's great. Thank you. So a little bit about the format. We'll be taking about half an hour just to kind of allow Miguel to share with us what he's working on and, who Edith Stein is, first of all. And then after that, we will go to the audience for any questions that you have, anything that you want to share, any thoughts that kind of come up and that are inspired. So don't be shy. All right. So Miguel, anything you want to tell us about yourself, and and then just maybe let's start off with who Edith Stein was, just so we're all kind of on the same page for those of us who are unfamiliar with her and her work.
Sure, I think I'll start with who Edith Stein was. She was a saint, a philosopher, a thinker, a very religious person. She was born, I'll give a brief biography of her life. She was born on Yom Kippur of 1891 in modern-day Poland. She was born in a very traditional Jewish family, though as she got older, in her teens, she became agnostic. And, well, she was always described by her family and by her friends since a young age as a very bright person, as someone with a very bright mind who always excelled academically, right? So her mother helped her get into the University of Breslau in 1911, where she studied, amongst other things, psychology. And during her stay at the University of Breslau, she read Husserl's Logical Investigations, and that's when she became aware and had a very strong connection to Husserl's project of phenomenology. So in 1913, she transferred to the University of Göttingen, where Husserl was a teacher, to study under him and form herself as a phenomenologist. I hope it's okay if I'm giving a brief biography.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. There she met with other early phenomenologists who would go on to form her thought, and such as Reinach, who some of you may know. And she also attended some informal lectures by Max Scheler, a very important phenomenologist, from which she got the idea to start thinking more profoundly and philosophically about faith and religion, though she was still, at that point, agnostic. In 1914, as you all know, World War I broke out, so she had to go on some tours as a war nurse, for which she received a Medal of Honor and Bravery. Reinach, her friend, was killed during World War I. And when she returned to the university, she met Roman Ingarden, another one of her greatest influence, another phenomenologist and student of Husserl. And by 1916, she was already working on her doctoral thesis on the problem of empathy, a phenomenological account of empathy. Though Husserl was offered a better job at the University of Freiburg, and so he transferred there, and Edith Stein sometime later went with him so he could be his thesis reader. She graduated from Freiburg with the highest honors, the summa cum laude, and became Husserl's assistant. There, in Freiburg, she met with another very important phenomenologist, Martin Heidegger, And when she applied for a position at the University of Göttingen, she was rejected. And in that period, she stopped working with Husserl and returned to Breslau to, think things through. And that's when she started thinking on reconsidering her faith. And by 1921, after reading Saint Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, she decided she would convert to Catholicism, something that would mark all of her thought and writings from then on. Right, so by 1922, she was baptized as a Catholic and went to Speyer to become a teacher to young women and girls at a monastery. She kept writing for Husserl's Philosophy magazine. She kept in touch with the phenomenologists, but she was a lot more focused on developing her faith at that time. She translated St. Thomas Aquinas' De Veritae, or On Truth, into German, and became very well acquainted with the thought of the theologian. She moved to Westphalia to be a professor in 1929, but by 1933, with the Nazis' rise of power, she was made to leave the university because of a decree that barred Jewish people from public professions. She then entered a Carmelite monastery and took the name of Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. She, of course, really admires Saint Teresa, but also Saint John of the Cross, two Spanish mystics. In 1939, her and her sister Rosa Stein, who had also converted to Catholicism, were moved to a monastery in Echt, Netherlands, because of the Nazi persecution of Jewish people. Stein, by that point, had become very anxious and very pessimistic about the outlook of the war and the discrimination and treatment of the Jewish people. By then, she had written a letter to the Pope asking him to denounce Nazism, which he never responded. By the time she was in the Netherlands, she only wrote one or two texts. The most important one of those was The Science of the Cross, an examination of the symbol of the cross and the life and philosophy of Saint John of the Cross. And tragically, by 1942, her and her sister were imprisoned, and they ended up at Auschwitz concentration camp, where she was murdered along many other Jewish people in a gas chamber. Later, you go, Christopher.
No, sorry. Continue. If you have more, please.
Yeah, she was beatified in 1987 by Pope John Paul II and canonized almost 10 years later in 1988 as saint. That's a brief overlook of her life, which, as you can see, was full of turmoil, full of grief and discrimination, but also a very prolific philosophical work, and an amazing grand oeuvre of philosophy.
Well, thank you for that, Miguel. That was really quite illuminating. I think Elisabeth and I and the rest of our listeners are just blown away by Stein's life. I'm very impacted by Stein's phenomenology. I was just wondering if you, I don't want to keep putting you on the spot. Your outline of her life, her biography was fantastic. I was wondering if maybe just for some of our listeners, if you could just, in a nutshell, kind of sum up the basic tenets of her phenomenology. If we could, I know it's going to be hard to do that. She's written a lot and many different texts are quite different, but how would you sum up her phenomenology, if you could?
Yeah. As you said, this is a very difficult thing to answer, but I think if we do it separately from her more theological period and her early phenomenological period, we can perhaps try to answer. So she was very drawn to Husserl's method, Husserl's phenomenology, but she had a more social, and for me, an ontology of alterity. So for her, the intersubjective, the social, the communal were very important in understanding being as such and consciousness and such. And you can see this from the first treatise she wrote, her doctoral thesis on empathy, where for her, empathic experiences were how we gain knowledge of the outer world. So, you know, her phenomenological outlook was very central and close to the idea of intersubjectiveness, embodiment, but most importantly, this sort of social ontology, which I think is where you can find the most differences from Husserl at that point, which of course Husserl would then be influenced by her and her philosophy by the time of Ideas too. But I think she's still very, very into the whole Husserlian phenomenology. And then by her later period, she tries to reconcile two different systems of philosophy for her inquiries into being, into consciousness, into what is a person. And these two philosophies are Husserlian phenomenology, transcendent Husserlian phenomenology, and also Thomism, or the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. So by this second period, where you have books like Potency and Act, The Structure of the Human Person, Finite and Eternal Being, she sort of reconciles from phenomenology how we can get to the universal essences of experience, and from Thomism, how these universal essences of experience relate to our relation with God, with the divine, with the eternal, and the atemporal. So I know this was very brief and perhaps I'm missing much context, but in a nutshell, I'd say that's where her phenomenology and her philosophy stands in these two periods.
That's great. You've obviously done a lot of reading of her, and that's wonderful. Thank you. So, maybe before we go any further, is it possible, Miguel, for you to kind of break down or define what phenomenology is for those of us who are less familiar with that term?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. There are many different understandings of phenomenology. If we're working with Edith Stein, we have to mainly work with Husserl's notion of phenomenology, which would be just that, the study of the essences of experience, experience as it is given to consciousness.
Wonderful, great. What I'm really inspired by her work is I think she's a great systematizer. She's a systematizer of, obviously, of Husserl's work, and Thomas Aquinas's work, and the synthesis of the two of them, which I think is quite original, because we know Heidegger in the early 1900s was working with Scotus and Aristotle, but we have this great Thomist tradition, and we have Edith Stein working through this phenomenology of Aquinas and of Husserl. Do we know, maybe you may not know the answer to this, how did Husserl take her work? Did he have any criticisms of her work, or was he encouraged by her project overall?
Yeah, he was very receptive to her work. As I mentioned, by the time she was Husserl's assistant and she helped edit Ideas 2, a work by Husserl, which was a follow-up to Ideas 1, Husserl integrated many ideas that Stein had developed on empathy, on intersubjectivity, on the body into Ideas 2. So I think we can say there is a clear influence in that early period. Here, Husserl really admired Stein. And as for Thomism and her reconciliation of phenomenology with Aquinas, we know that Husserl was also receptive and very, very grateful to her, in that in 1924, she writes a beautiful text, which I invite all of you to read. It's a delight, which is called What is Philosophy? And this text is a fictional, Platonic-like dialogue between Saint Thomas Aquinas and Husserl concerning the question of what is philosophy. She gives Thomas Aquinas the last word, where he, tries to summarize what is phenomenology and what is his third way, what is his philosophy. But really, the whole text is Edith Stein sort of starting to ground her own personal philosophy, drawing from the two. And she actually sent that text to Husserl as a birthday present, and Husserl loved it, and he sent her a text back. So yeah, we know he was very receptive throughout all of his life to Edith Stein's phenomenology and philosophical work. Though of course they did have some differences, they did have some encounters, but I think throughout their lives it was very amicable and mutual respect.
I think it is so fascinating to know that, which of the, kind of classic or canonical philosophers that most of us are studying on this path, to know who interacted with each other and the relationships between them. I think that's so fascinating. Thank you. So now for maybe a more personal question. How, Miguel, did you get interested in Edith Stein, and what does your work specifically focus on? What are you interested in investigating?
Right. Thank you so much for the question. Well, it's for many years I've been very interested in classical phenomenology, analytical phenomenology, but mainly classical phenomenology, Husserlian phenomenology. And from reading Husserl, you start reading about his students, who are obviously all very, very great and brilliant thinkers. And that's how I found out about Edith Stein. I really, connected with her ontology of alterity, as I like to call it, her social ontology. And she really fit with what I was working on and what I am working on. I mainly work within philosophy of mind, and particularly the philosophical problems concerning our inner speech, or the inner voice inside our heads, our inner monologue. And I found that Edith Stein's thesis on empathy, on synergia, on many things, can explain some of those concerns. For example, she writes in her doctoral thesis on empathy how we can feel empathy for ourselves. And she says that we can feel empathy for ourselves if we see ourselves from the eyes of the other. So I think that when we speak to ourselves, we are creating this alter ego in experience with which we can feel empathy for, and at the same time that alter ego can feel empathy for us because he sees us from the other person's eyes, as even though it is all occurring within one person. So I think her developing a phenomenology of alterity is very important for a lot of problems and questions in philosophy of mind.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful idea, the empathy for ourselves, and that there's an element of distance in that. I think in neuroscience, looking at neuroplasticity, there's this idea of the multiple perspective advantage, where, if we are kind of stuck in our inner world and preoccupied with our thoughts, we can easily kind of get self-absorbed and feel maybe depressed or sad or anxious. But when we kind of, so to speak, step outside of ourselves, we can kind of look at, approach our situation with maybe reason, with maybe more objectivity. And I know when I first started looking at Edith Stein, I was confused why she was trying to put distance into her idea of empathy instead of kind of just more sticking to the intimacy and maybe the unity between individuals that are already separate. But then, when she was talking about the compassion toward ourselves that I really kind of got it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point with the comparison to this neuroscience problem. She, of course, says in the empathy text that a deceptive view of ourselves can be corrected by seeing ourselves as the other sees us, which I also found to be a very striking and beautiful piece of writing. I think that also I agree with you that that's where she becomes paradigmatic in her first text, that she breaks by introducing distance from all of the other philosophers of empathy, like Hans Lips, and I think she also criticizes Husserl's and Schiller's idea of empathy, and but that's for me the most interesting aspect of her work, the introduction of alterity, of distance and difference.
How would you differentiate between this is putting you on the spot, Stein's concept of alterity and, let's say, someone like Levinas's concept of alterity and the face-to-face of the other in totality and infinity? Can there be can we make a comparison, or are they too radically different, or do you think Stein's concept of alterity is more practical or more philosophical, or how would you? Can we compare them, and if we can we differentiate them to a certain degree, or are they very close?
No, I definitely think that we can compare them, and not only with Levinas, but also with Paul Ricoeur. I think they both are working very, very similarly to what Stein was working on in regards to alterity. Of course, there are some differences, like the distances, the ontological distances Levinas takes from Husserl, which Levinas was a student of Husserl. I think in Stein's philosophy, alterity and the otherness or the other in relation to us is philosophized upon in a different manner, in the sense that it is more central. I think for Levinas, the encounter, the ethics of encountering the other exists more as a system of ethics, whereas for Stein, I think it's a fundamental part of her ontology.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I first learned about phenomenology as a research method in quantitative studies, kind of opening up a space for seeing what kind of valuable information we can find in the subjective experience, that we might be able to sort of kind of pursue the depth of the human experience as an individual, but then maybe generalize. And then the idea that I think Edith Stein says that, when we are, making this empathic approach or empathetic approach to someone, that two worlds are existing at the same time. So I think that's really interesting. So thank you for your explanation. So being myself a religious studies major, I have to really direct us toward her theology. So I don't know how much of her theological works that you've read, but I would be interested in just hearing in general what you think of her theology. I've only read bits and pieces in sort of a selected writings kind of book of her theology. And to me, it seems that her target audience is very different than her philosophical works. And yeah, so I don't know. So just so what are your thoughts about her theology? And if you could maybe describe some of her ideas that maybe make her theological project unique.
Yeah, that's a very, very great question and very necessary for understanding her whole work. So she really has a lot of treatises and texts on her theology and her theological philosophy. But I think the greatest of them all is Finite and Eternal Being, which is one of her last writings. It's a very, very dense, very large text, but she tries to develop ontology, epistemology, obviously a theology, a system of ethics, a description of what a person is. And, her influences at that time were, as I said, not only Thomas Aquinas, though of course that's who will be more prominent in that writing, but also to understand her theological period, we do need to sort of be a little familiar with the text I mentioned by Saint Teresa of Avila, which is the Interior Castle, which is sort of a view of the soul from within the soul itself, right? And all of a very mystic writing in that sense. So that was very profound for Edith Stein's development of a phenomenological account of religiosity. So before I get ahead of myself, she had many religious influences. Also, she writes one of her last texts on Pseudo Dionysius, and I think what makes for me her philosophy and her theology stand out is all found in Finite and Eternal Being, where she tries to describe precisely that. First, she starts from a phenomenological conscious phenomenal account of what is the first being, which is the limited being, temporally limited being, which is of course something she draws upon Husserl's phenomenology of internal time consciousness. And the relationship between this first being, this finite being, and the Cartesian ego, but also embodiment, the limitations of the outer world that the outer world sort of presses upon this first being. But the very interesting part, and where you can see that Edith Stein takes the divine and the godly as the most important part of her work, is the description of eternal being, which eternal being is a temporal being. It's being at every time. Eternal being is the pure act, recalling to the potency and act. And what she says about this eternal being is that we can't reach eternal being. So this is very similar to Thomistic theology, where we can't reach or truly reach or truly know God. But Stein says that we can only attain an image, and this image is found in finite being, or in the first being. And in this relationship, or this image that is found in the first being of eternal being, is where, if you are interested in her theological account, this aspect of her philosophy is central. And it was really the most important text, or it really is the most important text in her whole work, because in this relationship between first being and eternal being, which is mediated by the pure ego, or the pure I, which of course is a Husserlian concept, or at least she takes it from Husserl, you get this account of how for Stein, even if we can't know God, we can receive this image in our consciousness, in our being, even though our being is finite.
Wonderful. That's awesome. Did that answer your question, or do you have more questions for him about her theology, Elisabeth?
Yeah, I guess just one point that I wanted to make that I found really inspiring as well in her work is just her inclusivity. She seems very traditional on one hand, with the ideas that she kind of explains from Catholic theology, self-denial, and sacrificing sort of yourself to follow, and your own freedom to kind of follow the will of God. But I really love when she talks about how anyone's sincere seeking of the truth, even if they don't see it or put it in a context of religiosity, or think that they're seeking God, God recognizes that that pursuit of truth as seeking him, and it seems like she's kind of implying that, you know, that will be rewarded. And you know, I think maybe she kind of sees that with you know, how that kind of affects how she looks at her mother, and the difference between her own, you know, conversion to Christianity and her mother's steadfast Judaism. And it just seems to be very inclusive and pluralistic, that, you know, even if you're outside of the Christian worldview, if you're trying to see, if you have a pure seeking of the truth, then you, I don't know, that you can maybe reach salvation in the same way that, you know, her and her sisters could. Does that, is that, you know, kind of, am I on the right track when I'm kind of looking at those statements of hers?
Yeah, I think that is very correct. She is not really a thinker that discriminates or negates the possibility of understanding or knowing to other people. She actually, throughout all of her personal life, she always fought to she always fought for the possibility of equal education and equal opportunities for people of all backgrounds, no matter of gender. She was a suffragette, and she was in many associations in favor of women's education. But also, in regards to, she also fought against the discrimination of Jewish people and anti-Semitism. So yeah, I think that's very true what you just said. She doesn't come from a place of discrimination, but that everyone can achieve the universal truth, the universal understanding.
It's part of the reason why I wanted to do one of these spotlights on Edith Stein is because I think not only do I think she's a fantastic philosopher, but I also think she's a fantastic role model for women in the history of philosophy, and especially, you know, in the early 1900s, she was fighting for, you know, women to learn more in regards to the philosophical tradition. And I think she stands out in this sense, not only as someone that that is a brilliant mind, but also someone that stood by and fought for so many things, whether it was her fight against the Nazis and anti-Semitism, her fight for women, even the fact that when she became a full nun, she believed that, you know, I need to continue teaching, and she did. She taught her fellow sisters. I think I'm right about this, right? I think I'm right about some of this kind of biographical background about her.
Definitely.
So I think these are wonderful aspects about her philosophy. I've only read Potency and Act, and I read Potency and Act because I wanted a text to jump in, and I believe it's an unfinished text, but apparently right now Finite and Eternal Being is like $300 or something. So I have to wait to get that book. But you were saying that her more mature, her more philosophical stance, other than her work on the Science of the Cross, you really you really like and enjoy Finite and Eternal Being. Is it because she has this nice division between the divine and finitude, or what about this text draws you to her?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to mention that for what you were saying about what she wanted to do in her life, is that there is a story that she recalls from when she was young, where everyone was telling her that she was so intelligent and so bright, and that what she said was that she didn't care about being bright-minded or smart, that she really cared about being good. So I think that really speaks, and that she really lived like that throughout all of her life. In regards to Finite and Eternal Being, if you or anyone was also interested in Potency and Act, she revises Potency and Act in Finite and Eternal Being, and I think she does it in in a wonderful way. She extends it. She actualizes throughout in regards to her whole system. But for me, what I love the most about finite and eternal being is the way she explains consciousness. For me, as I said, I'm very interested in philosophy of mind. And I think her philosophy of consciousness in that work is just, extraordinary, mind-numbing, because for her, consciousness and the primordial state of consciousness, which is the pure I, in Husserlian terms, is in this sort of struggle between becoming and the infinite, the eternal, because for Stein and her theology, our first being, our pure ego or pure I, does not emerge from nowhere, but it is given, right? So I think this, paired with her phenomenological account of this consciousness and how this consciousness can look back upon itself and gain self-knowledge and gain knowledge of the world and gain knowledge of the image of God. I think it's just a monumental piece of philosophy, and for anyone interested in phenomenology, but also in ontology and metaphysics, I think it's a particularly wonderful piece of writing.
Really interesting. Well, thank you, Miguel. So I think if everyone's in agreement, it might be time to switch it over to our audience and allow those of you who have questions for Miguel, want him to clarify anything, or if you have any thoughts, or if you want to respond to anything that was said in the past half hour, that we can go ahead and do that. What do you think, Chris and Miguel?
Yeah, I think that would be... Oh, sorry, Miguel, I spoke over you.
No worries. I just said perfect. That's fine by me.
Great. So thank you so much for that, Elisabeth and Miguel. So if you have a question or a thought, just like what Elisabeth said, all you have to do is request to be a speaker. We'll accept, and you can ask your thought. You can ask your question or pose your thought to Miguel. This is, of course, an open discussion. Please don't be shy. There are no stupid questions. We're all here having a discussion, and we're all getting to know Edith Stein's work. So please, if you have something to say, just jump on in right away. And don't worry, Miguel, if there's no questions, I'll just keep grilling you.
Absolutely. I also have a million questions as well. So yeah, but we'll give everyone a minute. Sometimes it takes people a while to collect their thoughts.
Well, why don't you ask your question, Elisabeth, and while you're into the question, we'll see if anyone would like to pose a question while you're in the middle of or presenting your question.
Yeah, okay, that sounds great. Yeah, anyone interrupt me. All right, so I really wanted to go back to Edith Stein's feminism and her ideas of women. Because, I think we could probably characterize her as an essentialist in the sense that she felt that there were valuable intrinsic there's an intrinsic nature to women, and as there is to men. But she still has that sort of that is still a form of feminism, right? And we can see it in her ideas that there are, regardless of the sort of maybe almost opposite or complementary elements in men and women, there is diversity and there is a variety of inclinations and tendencies and personalities. So I just want to quote something that I thought was really interesting and get your idea on it, Miguel. So she says, the strong individual differences existing within both sexes must be taken into account. Many women have masculine characteristics just as many men share feminine ones. Consequently, every so-called masculine occupation may be exercised by many women as well as many feminine occupations by certain men. So I guess my question to you, Miguel, is What do you see, maybe that, and then other things that you've read, because you've read much more extensively than I have. What do you see in her feminism and her work on women and gender that can be utilized and inspiring for sort of the modern person today?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that's also one of the main interests of the people working to reanalyze and reinterpret Stein today from a feminist perspective. So yeah, I agree with you that there is a lot of and she's explicit about the essentializing aspect of men and women in her work. I think at the same time her goals were always for a sort of equality in terms of education and cultivation of intellect and cultivation of spiritual lives, right? And I think that's one of the things that we can really admire the most. She had in her essays on her series of essays on womanhood and on women, she tries to expand on this, on why exactly and how exactly can the cultivation of both intellect and the spiritual lives is necessary, and how it can be achieved for women. And I think that's a very admirable goal. Of course, spiritual for her doesn't necessarily mean religious or Catholic. Spiritual for her has to do with the spiritual aspect of the person, which is motivation and sort of the higher goals. So she had this idea of a project for fulfillment in the case of women, which were of course or which are of course discriminated against. I think that's a lot of what is being rescued and reevaluated in her philosophy. Of course, she was in dialogue with the feminists of her age. She was not she did keep them in mind, and she did not agree with everything, but she was always in that dialogue. And I think in her earlier phenomenological work, there's a lot of things to admire for this era. For example, her emphasis on female embodiment, or the phenomenology of female corporality, of the female body. I think there's a lot to draw from there in the terms of modern day critical phenomenology, feminist phenomenology, which is really work to be done, because there is so much that her philosophy offers us. If you're interested, or if anyone else is interested, Springer, the publisher, actually released a book, I think a couple years ago, which is there is just a lot of academic essays on Stein, but one of the central points of the book is gender and feminism. So I may have to look up the name of the book. I don't recall it off the top of my mind just now, but it's it tries to do what you asked.
If
That
you
is really exciting. I'm going to absolutely. If you find the title of it, maybe you can tweet, a link to it, because I definitely want to check it out. Thanks for that suggestion.
Yeah, Miguel, if you want to send, you could tweet it out as well. If you want to send me the name of the text, I can also tweet it out along with the link to our show tonight, and they can go hand in hand if you'd like.
Yeah. Oh, sorry if I can say something else very quickly. I think I missed this, but I think it's the most important thing. There's a lot of criticisms of Husserl's phenomenology, which has to do about how his subject, or the subject of his philosophy, goes unexamined, right? And I think Stein is one of the first to actually introduce a split in that subject, to question, because she introduces the gender difference to the phenomenological subject. So I think that's one of the the greatest contributions of her work as well.
That's amazing, awesome. And we're just firing questions at you. If there are any questions, please, all you have to do is request to speak, and you can, throw a thought out or an idea. While we're waiting, if there's no questions, Miguel, I'm just wondering, because I haven't read this, and I don't want to throw you on the spot yet again, because I've done that like 3 or 4 times. But you're always landing on your feet perfectly, and you're very articulate, and I really want to thank you for that. What is the science of the cross? What is this aspect of Stein's later work? Maybe in response to her kind of grounding of Catholic philosophy and her faith, but what is the actual science of the cross? If I can just reiterate that one question, because I don't know that about her thought, so I'm learning a lot from this as well. So please.
Yeah. Okay. I think that is probably one of the hardest questions, because the science of the cross was written. I think, I don't think if it was ever officially finished, because the latest revisions were in 1942, the same year that she was murdered. And by the time she was writing it, she already had in her mind that she was going to be sent to the concentration camps. She was preparing by going out in the cold with few clothes and going days without eating to prepare for life in the camp. So I think that also translates in how the book is written is very dense. But basically, the science of the cross is an examination of both the iconographic aspects of the cross in theology, what it exemplifies about sort of the theology of the New Testament. It is also an examination of the mysticism and philosophy of Saint John of the Cross, and I think it's where she tries to expand and to finish her metaphysical project that she starts in Finite and Eternal Being. By if you look at the book, she goes over every topic, so knowledge, but by the time of the science of the cross, because she's delving so much into the image, I think the central thing in science of the cross is the symbol or the image of God in consciousness, or in our daily life, so to speak, and in our inner lives, that she sort of shifts her perspective on what she builds up in Finite and Eternal Being, and it takes a turn towards a more distancing aspect in her epistemology. So she says she augments the gap between person and object of knowledge, and the knowledge of God, even more than she does in Finite and Eternal Being. But I think that we cannot ignore or detach it from the context in which it was written. But I think, yeah, it's definitely, I think, her most difficult work, and at the same time, it's very intriguing. And as Elisabeth said earlier, I think in that book it is clear that her audience is not the same audience as her earlier phenomenological writings.
I was watching some brief documentary on bits and pieces of her life, and this story blew me away to the point where I had like tears in my eyes when I heard this. Apparently, while in Auschwitz, many of the Jewish people that were being prepared to be gassed, she would walk over to all of them and just talk with them, and even pray with them, and calm them down. She would look after all of the children, and she even had Nazi soldiers coming up to her apparently and saying, "I don't know what we're doing. I don't know what we're doing." Like and just like absolutely blown away at her character, that she knew she was going to die, and she was almost, I don't want to say stoic about it, but helping and was there nonstop, and was telling the soldiers, "Oh no, I forgive you. I forgive you." That is something that blew me away.
Yeah, it's there is also a story which is very, very similar to what you mentioned, that when she was being sent to the camp, she was given an option because of her prominence and sort of popularity to help her escape and not face the concentration camps. But she refused because she said it would be a greater punishment for her to live and go on living while her Jewish brothers and sisters were being slaughtered. I think that also speaks to her great human character.
Yeah, I think that this is such an important line of thought and conversation, because you really see this steadfast sort of commitment to, kind of surrendering oneself and submitting to God's will, and sort of seeing, Jesus's sacrifice as kind of a model that I think the truest followers, the deepest followers, that are willing to kind of go to the very interior kind of level of the soul's castle, will kind of go along with. I think it's in perhaps Hidden Life, that she says, "The day on which God has unrestricted power over our hearts, we shall also have unrestricted power over his." So it's kind of like going through the ultimate fire, and, and having sort of hope or optimism, or because of the union with God. So it's really interesting, the emphasis of suffering and in just complete obedience, even to the death. There's another quote, if I could, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but just one quote that I really liked. She said, that seems to kind of emphasize the intensity of which she felt this line of thinking. She says, "The spouse whom she," talking about the one whose soul is awakened, "the spouse whom she chooses is the lamb that was killed." So this is kind of the manifestation. This is the embodiment of, or the image, the aspect of the spouse that she is emphasizing. It says, "If she is to enter into the heavenly glory with him, she must allow herself to be fastened to his cross. The 3 vows are the nails. The more willingly she stretches herself out on the cross and endures the blows of the hammer, the more deeply she will experience the reality of her union with the crucified." So it's a very mystical type of thought, line of thinking, that Teresa of Avila, kind of, I think she felt inspired by. So one thing that I wanted to ask you, Miguel, is, how do you understand this sort of juxtaposition of suffering and the sacred?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, in Finite and Eternal Being, she's also explicit that for us to gain knowledge of the infinite and the eternal, we will have to endure psychic pain, at least. And this, abandonment, which is sort of or abandonment of the self, which is a theme that is, also has a mystical history, I think, is how she conceives of gaining knowledge of the infinite and of the eternal. So for her, there is no gaining this knowledge, which is the highest knowledge of life, without the psychic pain and this sort of renunciation.
Okay, that brings to mind a really good connection with her, with empathy, with her concept of empathy, right? Because for empathy, it's the disclosure of another world. It's learning through other people without, still grounded in ourselves, but learning about other people. And so, how do we grow and become maybe even like God, who sees everything and sees from all angles and is not limited, except to have sort of every experience, and that, you know, involves pain and suffering, I guess.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I think it's definitely that as she describes, that there's an urge to pull you toward the outside. At the same time, the phenomenological attitude and this mystical attitude is to, you know, resist that struggle and try to keep looking inward toward your soul or your consciousness.
Right, that's a really powerful way of articulating it, because I think that, you know, when, you know, we can have the perspective of being threatened by the other and losing our sense of self, if we try to understand them, if we try to connect with them to the extent that we really understand how they see the world and what they're feeling. But to let ourselves go and kind of surrender our boundaries with each other, you know, there's such a reward for that, in that sort of connection with others, you know. And I think that was probably a lot, she proved that in her actions as well, right? Because she said, you know, you can't stay in the protected walls of the monastery, you know, you have to go out and be kind of, not to superimpose Buddhism, but a lotus in the mud, and, you know, get dirty and expose yourself to others and differences, and this is how, you know, and there's sort of a sacred kind of aspect of it that you won't get if you stay isolated in yourself.
Yes, definitely.
You know, I'm just thinking, this could be, you know, semi-problematic, but I'm just thinking about how many parallels there are between Stein and Simone Weil. Of course, Weil never really, became a Catholic, but in the end, she was very close to a priest friend. She also decided to, you know, join the front lines during the Spanish War. She also joined, you know, left a cushy teaching position so she could be along with the workers in a factory that, you know, brought her ill, and was really all about her philosophy, but also at the same time, also a very spiritual writer as well too. And, you know, I see a lot of parallels between, I haven't read Finite and Eternal Being, but I can see some parallels between Gravity and Grace and Weil and Stein's work. Although I think Stein doesn't write in aphorisms like the kind of the write-up that's in Gravity and Grace. But do you think that's an accurate account, maybe a parallel between the two of them, or am I completely out of the water here?
Well, as you may know, Christopher, that those two, Simone Weil and Edith Stein, are my, you know, the philosophers that have inspired me the most in my life. So it is a very central question to me. I think, yes, there is a lot of biographical similarities and definitely some in their work too. But I think there is a fundamental separation or difference, which I think for to give context for Simone Weil in her sort of mysticism, there needs to be a total destruction, a total abandonment of the self, so that the self can be possessed and contacted and loved by God. And this can never happen for Stein's ontology, because the first thing is the self. The first thing is the first being is this being of our consciousness, of our I, our ego, right? So I think that's where the biggest ontological differences between the two are, though there are a lot of similarities in their approach to mysticism and to religion and to the philosophy of the state, for example, right? but I think there is a fundamental difference because of Stein's phenomenological and formation, so to speak.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. If there are any other questions, if you hit the request button, you can ask your question. If not, we've been going for about an hour. Unless Miguel can go for another 10 minutes or 15 minutes, or if not, then we can probably end the show now. Totally up to both you and Elisabeth. Unless there are other questions. If not, this was very enlightening, and this was a really special episode for me. Also, I don't know if everybody knows about this, but Elisabeth is now going to be my permanent co-host on Philosophy in the Spotlight. I watched a lot of her work on YouTube and reached out to her, and super, super kind and friendly, and joined. And you can see already how much she's added to the dynamics of this live discussion.
That's so kind of you, Chris. I really appreciate it, and I'm so glad to be here. I feel so liberated and inspired by conversations that we have, and just people like Miguel who are so passionate about particular philosophers. We can learn so much. So I would say, if we have one last question for Miguel, if anyone's interested in starting to read Edith Stein and they haven't read her before, what book would you recommend people start with?
Well,
that's a great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would definitely recommend starting with her doctoral thesis on empathy. It is a great text. It's one of the only, true examinations of the problem of empathy that exists in the history of philosophy. I think if you understand that text, if you connect with that text, then you can do the same for her whole work. The ideas that are presented in that piece of philosophy are present also throughout her whole philosophical outlook, and that's for her primary text. I think if you are also interested in secondary literature, the book I'd recommend that you start with is Mary Catherine Basehart's Person in the World. That's the name of the book. It's very short. It's like 170 pages, but it's a really good overview of her biography, her philosophy. But primarily I'd recommend starting with the thesis on empathy.
I love that. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Miguel. And thank you, everyone, for joining and listening. And, I don't want to impose anything on Miguel, but maybe sometimes people have a question that they think of after. Miguel, is it okay if people contact you to ask you a question or get some advice on something concerning Edith Stein in the future?
Yeah, of course. My social media is always open for that kind of stuff. And Chris knows I really like to talk about philosophy. So yeah, any questions, anytime, I'm available.
Miguel is an active member of a Discord server that I run, and he is such a refreshing person to have on. He's always very positive, really good interlocutor. He's able to see different positions and respond so nice. And you don't get that a lot on the internet. You get a lot of sometimes you have a lot of negative interactions with people. So Miguel, thank you for coming here. It's not easy to be on the hot seat, but you came here. You did this fantastic presentation, both biographical and phenomenological, and I think both Elisabeth and I are so thankful. Elisabeth told me that she bought a whole bunch of books by Edith Stein, and I think that's great. So we're already inspiring other individuals to read this wonderful philosopher's work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you both so much, Elisabeth and Christopher. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I love coming here and talking about Edith Stein, and hearing your questions. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we hope that all of you come back. The next time we have a great lineup of people coming to interview lots of different philosophers to talk about. So we hope to see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.